Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Park Tao, says they've made significant headway with U.S. officials on a number of deals. Tao says one of the key discussions include increasing trade between the two nations. The engagements also included the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, which is currently under review. Let's unpack the story further. We're joined by Yash Ramkolowan. He's the Managing Director at DNA Economics. Yash, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. The President, as we know, in his press briefing, stressing that our country needs foreign direct investment. We need to start working on a plan to create an environment, surely then, Yash, to encourage that FTI.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. Yes, very interesting developments yesterday. If we just reflect on the meeting between President Ramaphosa and President Trump, I guess necessary theatrics to move the discussion on SA's relationship with the USA forward. Maybe just stepping back in terms of the gripe overall that the USA has had with South Africa from a trade and investment perspective, they reflected on a number of issues in terms of the trade barriers that they perceive as being raised by South Africa for US investment and US exports into South Africa. And that's the basis for the tariff surcharge of 31% that hangs over South Africa at the moment. A lot of it is very difficult to fully articulate because it's not clear exactly what the issues that are raised by the USA are actually referring to. They do mention tariffs. They do mention import restrictions. They do also mention specific issues around certification and standards that are imposed on a range of goods that come into South Africa, including electronic goods, some agricultural goods such as pork, poultry, and blueberries. But if we reflect fully on the issue around foreign direct investment, I think it's clear to most economists of the orthodox sense that South Africa does really need a steep injection of foreign direct investment, and not just from the USA, but from any willing and ready partners across the globe.
Yeah.
From a US perspective, it's two key areas that I think have been of focus in terms of the discussions that have happened between Monday and today between the two parties, USA and South Africa. I think the one is around gas. And so there's been, I think, a strong mention around the need for South Africa to import more gas from the USA, and that could form some of the negotiations that are taking place. There's also discussions, as I understand, around incentives for mineral exploration, which would incentivize US investment into South Africa. And that is obviously focusing on the immediate issue around critical minerals. And then finally, there also has been increasing discussion around tariff barriers, and specifically the extent to which South Africa can reduce some of those tariff barriers that influence the US's ability to enter into South African markets. So I think those are some of the key issues. And then obviously the big one that I think we're all aware of is around the BEE ownership requirements that have been raised, and specifically by the likes of Elon Musk, in terms of South Africa's requirements for BEE ownership. And there again, my understanding is that there is some sort of equity equivalence program that has been discussed and discussion about expanding that. And potentially that might also influence the way in which the transformation fund that the DTIC has formulated evolves and progresses in terms of implementation.
Yeah, there was a lot of placating, wasn't there, in that meeting in the Oval Office yesterday? And rightfully so. The US is not a trading partner, second though they might be to China, but not one that we can lose. AGOA itself is incredibly valuable to businesses in our country.
Yes and no. So it is an interesting dynamic. Obviously, the US is an important partner, but it only accounts for between 8 and 10% of South Africa's exports in global terms. So an important partner, but I think a partner that we have to treat on maybe not equal terms, but less equal terms than the likes of the EU or China. And then specifically around AGOA, there's this narrative that AGOA is the be-all and end-all for South African exports into the US. The reality is that AGOA and the GSP only make up around 25% of South Africa's exports to the US. And it is actually very sector specific. So the sectors that would be most impacted by the loss of AGOA would be vehicles and transport equipment, which actually 95% of their exports into the US are under AGOA. And then the likes of the agricultural sector. So vegetables, about 85% of vegetables are under AGOA, and then about 75% of food and beverage products. So in some sectors, AGOA is very important, but even then, the level of tariff preference is actually quite low. So if you look at vehicles, there's only a 2% tariff preference on average for exports under AGOA, and only around 6% tariff preference for food and beverages. So the narrative around AGOA, not to discount its importance, is very sector specific. And so I think you've seen that in some of the discussions that have been had. It's really the automotive sector and some of the agricultural associations that have been pushing for ensuring that we don't lose AGOA.
Yeah, I mean, in an economy like ours, though, even though it is very sector specific and the number is not as huge as perhaps all of the drama around it seems to suggest, but in a country like ours, where we're struggling with growing our economy, in fact, GDP has been revised down yet again, we still can't afford it, small as it may be.
Sure, that point taken. But I think the bigger picture needs to be looked at. The genesis of the trip that President Ramaphosa has made to the USA is actually really around the 31% tariff surcharge that was imposed in April. If that continues, AGOA is relevant. Whether or not we lose AGOA becomes largely irrelevant, because it'll be a 31% tariff surcharge even under products that are under AGOA. So I think in terms of the bigger picture, AGOA remains important, but more important than that is trying to ensure that come the 3-month period where we've had that pause in the tariff escalation, after that, we don't resume with the 31% tariff surcharge. And I think that is really what we need to focus on in terms of our negotiations with the USA. AGOA is up for renewal. My understanding is that there's discussions that are going to take place not bilaterally between the USA and South Africa, but through a USA-Africa trade forum. And so it would be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think in the immediate sense, what really needs to happen is focusing on that tariff surcharge and how to come to agreement to not have that imposed on South Africa.
So when the Trade, Industry and Competition Minister, Parks Tau, talks about his team presenting an alternative framework to AGOA, what do you reckon that might look like, particularly because AGOA includes the continent as well?
Yeah, I mean, the only real replacement for AGOA could be a reciprocal arrangement between South Africa and the USA. So a bilateral trade agreement of sorts, and actually it would be a bilateral trade agreement between the Southern African Customs Union and USA, given that South Africa is part of SACU. But again, it's unclear the extent to which that could happen in the very short term. These types of bilateral agreements typically take months, if not years, to finalize and agree on, although there is obviously a lot more impetus around this, given the way in which the tariff wars have escalated in the last 3 months. So any replacement for AGOA would largely be a reciprocal arrangement between SACU and the USA, which would effectively replace whatever arrangement exists under AGOA.
Yash Ramkolowan, let me thank you for your time. Thanks for that analysis as we continue to track US-SA relations. Yash is the Managing Director at DNA Economics.